The cockpit was burning. Not the clean movie screen kind of burning, the kind that blistered paint and melted leather and filled your lungs with black smoke that tasted like chemicals and death. Below, through the cracked canopy glass, Billy Fiske could see the hangars at Tangmere Airfield. Mechanics were running. Ground crews were diving for cover. And somewhere in that maze of buildings and fuel stores, men who had never asked to be heroes were about to find out what an American millionaire's son thought their lives were worth. He was 29 years old. He had lied to get here. And now, with flames licking at his boots and every nerve in his body screaming to bail out, to pull the canopy release and tumble into the August sky, William Meade Lindsley Fiske III had to make a choice that would define not just his death, but everything America would become in the war it was still pretending it could avoid. The date was August 16, 1940. The time was 4:37 in the afternoon, and the most privileged man in the Royal Air Force was about to discover that there are some debts you can only pay with everything you have. Before we begin, please consider subscribing so you don't miss future videos about World War II. Now, let's take a closer look at this remarkable story. 6,000 miles away, in a Manhattan townhouse that overlooked Central Park, Billy Fiske's mother was hosting a garden party. The war in Europe was, of course, a topic of conversation. How could it not be, with France fallen and Britain standing alone? But it remained comfortably abstract. The champagne was French, purchased before the collapse. The canapés were perfect. And everyone agreed that President Roosevelt was handling the situation with admirable restraint. America had learned its lesson in the last war. This time, the boys would stay home. But Billy Fiske had never been good at staying home. He had won his first Olympic gold medal at 16, the youngest bobsled champion in history, guiding his sled down the icy runs of St. Moritz with the same aggressive confidence he brought to everything else. 4 years later, he did it again in Lake Placid, and by then the newspapers were calling him the Golden Boy, handsome, wealthy, fearless, blessed with the kind of easy charm that made people forget he was also relentlessly, almost recklessly competitive. His father, a banker who had built a fortune in the expansion of American railroads, had raised Billy to believe that excellence was not an aspiration, but an obligation. You did not simply participate, you won. And when war broke out in September of '39, Billy Fiske looked at the newsreels of Warsaw burning and London preparing, and made a calculation that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with a deeply American conviction, that when something needed doing, you showed up and did it. The problem was the law. The Neutrality Acts forbade American citizens from serving in foreign militaries. But Billy Fiske had spent enough time in Europe to know that laws were often more flexible than they appeared. He had money, he had connections, and on a cool spring day in 1940, he walked into a recruiting office in London and told them his name was William Fiske, Canadian citizen, eager to serve. They did not ask too many questions. Britain was desperate. The Luftwaffe was coming, and here was a man who could fly, who had, in fact, been taking flying lessons in California since '36, racking up hours in single-engine planes with the same obsessive dedication he had brought to mastering icy curves at 70 miles per hour. By July, he was assigned to 601 Squadron, the so-called Millionaires Squadron, a collection of aristocrats and socialites who flew Hawker Hurricanes and treated the war as if it were an extension of their London clubs. They were not, it must be said, particularly impressed by Americans. The general opinion was that Yanks talked too much, understood too little, and would probably run at the first sign of real trouble. Billy Fiske did not run. The Battle of Britain began in earnest on July 10th. The Luftwaffe came in waves, 50 bombers here, 100 fighters there, probing Britain's defenses, testing the resolve of the RAF pilots who scrambled 3, 4, 5 times a day to meet them. The strategy was simple. Destroy the airfields, eliminate the fighters, clear the way for invasion. By mid-August, the Germans were throwing everything they had at southern England, and the pilots of 601 Squadron were flying until their hands shook and their eyes burned, and they could not remember the last time they had slept more than 3 hours at a stretch. Billy Fiske thrived. He was not the best pilot in the squadron. That honor belonged to men like Willie Rhodes Morehouse, who had been flying since the last war, or Sir Archibald Hope, whose family tree included enough titles to fill a phone book. But Billy brought something else, an American optimism that bordered on lunacy. While his British comrades spoke in careful understatement about a bit of a scrap, or rather dicey weather, Billy would grin and say things like, "Let's go knock some Jerry's out of the sky," as if the whole thing were a particularly exciting football game. It drove them crazy. It also made them love him. On August 13th, the day the Luftwaffe called Eagle Day, the beginning of their final push, Billy flew 3 sorties. He shot down a Messerschmitt over Portsmouth, damaged another over the Isle of Wight, and returned to Tangmere with his Hurricane's fuselage stitched with bullet holes. The ground crew counted 23 separate hits. Billy climbed out of the cockpit, lit a cigarette, and asked if anyone wanted to play cards. 3 days later, he was dead. The morning of August 16th began with fog. It burned off slowly, revealing a perfect English summer day. Blue sky, warm sun, the kind of weather that made you forget there was a war on, until the siren started wailing. The first scramble came at 11. 601 Squadron climbed to 15,000 feet and intercepted a formation of Junkers bombers over the channel. Billy got one, a clean kill, the bomber spiraling down, trailing smoke, and was back on the ground by noon. The second scramble came at 2. More bombers, more fighters, the same desperate calculus of altitude and ammunition and fuel. Billy's Hurricane took hits, but nothing critical. He landed with his engine coughing and his fuel gauge reading nearly empty. The third scramble came at 4:15. By then, the pilots were exhausted. They had been fighting for 2 months without a break, flying planes that needed maintenance they were not getting, burning through pilots faster than the training schools could replace them. But the radar stations were reporting another wave incoming. Bombers, maybe 50 of them, with fighter escorts. And 601 Squadron had exactly 7 serviceable Hurricanes left. Billy Fiske climbed into his plane for the last time at 4:23. They caught the Germans over Tangmere itself. The Luftwaffe had finally figured out that if they wanted to break the RAF, they needed to hit the airfields directly, destroy the planes on the ground, crater the runways, kill the mechanics and armorers and everyone else who kept the Hurricanes flying. It was a smart strategy. It was also brutal. Billy was climbing through 8,000 feet when the Messerschmitts bounced them. Later, the other pilots would describe it as chaos. Planes everywhere, tracer fire cutting white lines through the blue sky, the constant chatter of machine guns, and the occasional bright explosion when someone's fuel tank caught. Billy managed to get on the tail of a Messerschmitt and gave it a burst, but then something hit him from behind. Later investigation would suggest it was cannon fire from a Bf-110. And suddenly, his Hurricane was no longer flying straight. The shells had torn through the engine cowling, shredded the fuel lines, and ignited something that turned the front of his plane into a furnace. Within seconds, flames were pouring back into the cockpit, curling around the instrument panel, reaching for Billy's face. He had maybe 10 seconds to decide. Standard procedure was clear. Bail out. Pull the canopy release, unbuckle, kick yourself clear, pull the ripcord, float down into a nice English field where someone would give you tea and drive you back to base. Billy Fiske knew the procedure. He had been trained on it. And he knew that if he bailed out right now, his plane, still carrying 150 gallons of fuel and several hundred rounds of ammunition, would plunge straight into Tangmere Airfield, where 30 men were working on aircraft and 50 more were running for shelter. He stayed in the cockpit. What Billy Fiske thought about in those final seconds, no one will ever know. Perhaps he thought about his mother's garden parties. Perhaps he thought about the bobsled runs at St. Moritz, that perfect combination of speed and control. Perhaps he thought about the girl he had been seeing in London, or the fact that his father had told him not to go, or the absurd cosmic joke of surviving 2 Olympic gold medals and 100 dogfights only to die because he could not stand the thought of killing people who had never asked to be in his war. Or perhaps he did not think at all. Perhaps he simply acted, the way you act when your training and your character and everything you have ever believed about who you are converges into a single moment of terrible clarity. He could see the airfield through the smoke and flames. He could see the hangars, the fuel stores, the men scrambling for cover. And with the control stick bucking in his hands and the heat blistering his skin through his flight suit, Billy Fiske pointed his burning Hurricane at the one patch of open grass that looked clear and rode the plane all the way down. The crash was spectacular. The Hurricane hit the ground at 120 miles per hour, cartwheeled once, and came to rest in a smoking heap 50 yards from the nearest building. The fuel tanks exploded, a rolling orange fireball that sent black smoke 1,000 feet into the air. But the explosion was contained. The hangars were intact. The fuel stores were safe. And the men who had been running for cover were still alive to wonder what kind of crazy American would choose to burn rather than let his plane kill them. It took 4 men to pull Billy out of the wreckage. He was still conscious. That was the worst part. The flames had done terrible things. The doctors would later catalog burns over 70% of his body, including his hands, face, and chest. But he was conscious and talking, asking if everyone was all right, apologizing for making a mess of the landing. They took him to the Royal West Sussex Hospital in Chichester. The doctors did what they could, but this was 1940, and there were no skin grafts, no antibiotics that could handle the infections that set in when that much skin is burned away. Billy Fiske lasted 2 days. He spent most of that time drifting in and out of consciousness, occasionally asking about his squadron, occasionally mumbling things that the nurses could not quite make out. On August 18th, at 11:30 in the morning, he finally let go. The official cause of death was listed as shock and burn injuries sustained in combat. But the men of 601 Squadron knew better. Billy Fiske had not been shot down. He had chosen to die, deliberately and with full knowledge of what he was doing, because the alternative was unthinkable. He was the first American pilot killed in World War II, the first American to die fighting for Britain, and he died 18 months before Pearl Harbor would make his decision legal, 3 years before Normandy would vindicate it, and 70 years before anyone would think to ask whether a man who lies about his citizenship in order to fight someone else's war is a hero or a fool. The British did not forget. In 1941, with London still burning and the outcome of the war very much in doubt, a memorial tablet was installed in St. Paul's Cathedral. It sits there today, a small bronze plaque among hundreds of others commemorating the dead of 2 world wars. The inscription is simple: William M. L. Fiske III, an American citizen who died that England might live. It does not mention the Olympics. It does not mention the lying or the fake Canadian identity or the fact that he was breaking American law every day he wore a British uniform. It simply states a fact. An American came and an American died, and England is grateful. But the inscription does not tell the whole story. It does not tell you about the mechanics at Tangmere who went back to work that evening, repairing planes for men who would fly them the next day, because Billy Fiske had made sure the hangars were still standing. It does not tell you about the fuel stores that did not explode, or the bombs that did not go unfused, or the chain of small consequences that rippled outward from one man's decision to stay in a burning plane when every instinct screamed at him to jump. And it does not tell you about the calculation he must have made in those final seconds. The cold arithmetic of one life weighed against 30, of dying horribly versus living with the knowledge that you could have prevented it and chose not to. Billy Fiske was not prepared for heroism. He was a rich kid who liked fast things and pretty girls and winning gold medals. He was not supposed to be in Britain. He was not supposed to be flying hurricanes. And he was absolutely not supposed to be making life and death decisions about people he had never met in a country that was not his own, fighting a war that his government insisted was none of America's business. But he was there, and when the moment came, he did what Americans have always done when faced with an impossible choice. He decided that some things matter more than survival, and he paid the price. By late 1941, America was in the war, and Billy Fiske's decision no longer looked quite so radical. By 1945, with the concentration camps liberated and the world finally understanding what had been at stake, his choice seemed almost inevitable. And by the time the 21st century rolled around, he had become a footnote, one name among millions, a small story in a very large war. But the men at Tangmere remembered, and their children remembered, and somewhere in the archives of the Royal Air Force there is a yellowed report that describes the crash of Hurricane number P3059 on August 16, 1940, and notes in dry official language that the pilot exhibited exceptional skill and courage in preventing his aircraft from striking occupied buildings, despite catastrophic damage and imminent danger to his person. That is one way to describe it. Another way, the way Billy's mother described it when she finally learned the truth years later, after the grief had dulled into something she could live with, is that her son looked at the world and saw a choice between what was safe and what was right. And he picked right, and it killed him. She never forgave him for it. She also never stopped being proud. The Hurricane that Billy Fiske flew on his last mission was never rebuilt. The wreckage was cleared away, the parts salvaged for other planes, and within a week there was no physical evidence that it had ever existed. But the absence it left, the space where 30 men should have died and did not, echoed forward through time in ways that are impossible to measure. How many of those mechanics survived the war? How many went home to wives and children? How many of those children had children of their own? And how many of those grandchildren are alive today because a rich American kid with Olympic gold medals decided that his life was worth less than theirs? The math is impossible. The debt is unpayable. And that, perhaps, is the point. Billy Fiske did not save Britain. He did not win the Battle of Britain or turn the tide of the war. He simply made a choice in a burning cockpit on a summer afternoon. And because of that choice, some people lived who otherwise would have died. It was not enough to change history. It was only enough to change 30 futures, and the futures that branched from those futures, and all the small, invisible ways that one moment of courage ripples outward through time, until it becomes indistinguishable from everything else that makes us who we are. In St. Paul's Cathedral, tourists walk past his memorial every day without noticing it. The bronze has oxidized to a dark green. The letters are hard to read in the dim light. And most people, if they stop at all, glance at it and move on. Because who has time to think about one dead pilot from a war that ended 80 years ago? But on certain days, on the 16th of August specifically, someone always leaves flowers. Red roses usually, sometimes a small American flag. And if you look closely at the base of the memorial, you will find dozens of small notes written in shaky handwriting by very old men who remember what it was like to work on hurricanes at Tangmere Airfield in 1940, and who remember the sound of a plane crashing into the grass instead of into them, and who remember thinking, years later, when they finally learned the full story, an American did that, an American chose that, and England lived.